Support for this podcast comes from Boston University's Questrom School of Business, presenting the Is Business Broken podcast, featuring conversations about the role of business, stakeholder relations, and government at bu.edu/Questrom or wherever podcasts are available.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Simon Rios, in for Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Today is the 20th anniversary of gay marriage becoming legal in Massachusetts. The right for same-sex couples to marry was brought about by the Goodridge Decision, which made Massachusetts the first state in the country to secure marriage equality. To tell us more about the history of the fight for marriage equality in the Commonwealth, we're speaking with Arlene Isaacson, co-chair of the Massachusetts LGBTQ Political Caucus, formerly known as the Mass Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. Arlene, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Simone.
Arlene, take us back to May 17th, 2004. That moment was preceded by a decision in the Supreme Judicial Court, the Goodridge Decision. What was it like when that ruling finally came down?
Interestingly, it was a bit of a mixed bag. We knew before the decision came down, we had been fighting constitutional amendments to prohibit marriage equality for the previous few years. And we had some hellish battles before then. We knew that if the decision came down in our favor, the news would be simultaneously really, really good, because we'd have the right to marry, and really, really bad, because our opponents were going to tenaciously fight to undo that right by offering yet another constitutional amendment to prohibit our right to marry. And that's exactly what happened. So on the night of the celebration we were having about the Goodridge decision, I and a few people were in the back of the room, and I was kind of teary because I knew that not only were we heading into a legislative buzzsaw where the legislature was going to vote on this issue, and I knew we did not have the votes to defeat the marriage equality ban. And then I confess simultaneously, I was also selfishly a little bit upset because I had very young children at the time, and I knew this was going to take me away from them for what I thought would be 3 years, and it ended up being more than that. So it was a night of very mixed emotions for me and some of the key activists.
Okay, Arlene, so here we are 20 years after Goodridge, but the fight goes back even further to the 90s and probably before that. If you could talk a bit about why the venue for the marriage equality fight was in Massachusetts. There were similar fights around the country, but marriage equality activists decided that they stood the best chance here. Why was that?
That's a good question. You're right that DOMA, which stands for the Defense of Marriage Act, that's the name our opponents gave to marriage prohibitions. DOMA's passed in the federal government, and they passed in 40 states in this country. Our opponents were aiming next for Massachusetts because they figured rightly, if they could prohibit marriage in our Constitution in Massachusetts, then there was no state in the nation where it would pass, not California, not New York, not anywhere. And so going after Massachusetts was our opponent's top priority. Conversely, for our people, Massachusetts was discussed at the national level by attorneys, and they thought that Massachusetts was a good place to start because, A, the wording of our Constitution was such that it made a good decision possible, and B, the people sitting on the Supreme Judicial Court, the SJC in Massachusetts, were not all super right-wing people, so there was a possibility they might decide in our favor. But the minute the word got out that they were filing it, the move by our opponents to prohibit marriage in our Constitution happened within a nanosecond. In 1998 is when the first DOMA was filed in Massachusetts, and we finally defeated it in 2007. So that was 10 years. But the key is also that a lot of folks don't realize, A, that we were the first state in the nation to defeat a marriage prohibition, and B, that it took us 10 years because we didn't have the votes in the first 9 years to defeat it. The only way we were able to defeat it was by avoiding having a vote on the issue. We used every parliamentary maneuver and every parliamentary trick in the book to keep the legislature from voting on something that we knew we were going to lose, until finally in 2007 we had enough votes to defeat it.
Talk about what the political context was like back then in the early 2000s, late 90s. Why was it that there was so much opposition to gay marriage in Massachusetts?
You know the expression, what's past is prologue. Massachusetts was ahead of the other states when it came to passing an anti-discrimination measure in 1989. And it said, you can't discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation in employment, housing, and credit. That took us 17 years to pass. And it was adding the word sexual orientation to an existing body of law that said you couldn't discriminate based on race and creed and color and religion, etc. We were trying to add 2 words, and that took us 17 years. Our state legislature was filled with a lot of people who listened closely to what the church told them to do, and in particular, the Catholic Church in Massachusetts was an especially powerful force in this state. And legislators, even though they voted to pass the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill in 1989, it was a very close vote. We won it by only 1 or 2 votes. And legislators were not prepared to go as far as granting us the right to marry because they viewed that, in some cases, as turning the world asunder. And they weren't willing to risk it. It was a bridge too far for them to cross. So we had only 25% of the votes we needed in the state legislature in order to defeat the DOMAs.
Okay, Arlene Isaacson, we're going to take a quick break here. When we get back, I want to talk about the current landscape of gay rights in Massachusetts and beyond.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back with Arlene Isaacson. We're talking about the 20th anniversary of gay marriage becoming legal here in Massachusetts. Arlene, 2 decades after the fact, gay marriage is legal everywhere in the United States. If somebody had told you back then, in 2004, that would be the case, would you have believed them?
I'm not sure that I would have. Many of us thought that marriage equality was a pie-in-the-sky dream back in the 1990s and the early aughts. But once we were in the marriage fight, and once we had won that right in the court, and once we had defeated it in our legislature, we knew it was only a matter of time before it would spread across the nation. You know, part of what we knew was that one of the best ways to prove that marriage equality would not tear Western civilization asunder, as our opponents feared, was simply to have gay and lesbian folks get married, to prove to them that once we had the right to marry, the sun would still come up in the morning. And, you know, one of the arguments they used to use against us was that if we had the right to marry, it would harm the institution of marriage and harm their marriages. And we used to say, how in the world is our ability to get married going to harm your marriage with your spouse? That makes no sense whatsoever. Well, we could say that till the cows came home. What really mattered is they had to see it. And so as soon as we had the right to marry, slowly but surely people started to see, oh, the only thing that's really changed is I may have to buy more wedding gifts than I did before. So it was the empirical evidence we needed to prove the case we had been making for years before that.
Bring this home a little bit, Arlene. The idea that same-sex couples before 2004 were prevented from getting married and thus accessing a lot of benefits, obviously for tax purposes and other things. Talk about the impact that this had on the lives of people who were now able to get married.
It was enormous. There were 1,400 benefits, rights, protections, and privileges that come with a marriage license, most of which people don't realize, don't pay attention to at all. They run the gamut from being able to provide health insurance to your spouse, being able to provide pension benefits to your spouse, health insurance coverage to your children if they're not your bio kids. Now, one of the benefits that did not come automatically with the marriage license, however, was what we call parentage laws. And that's actually one of the battles that we're fighting today. I thought rather, that once we had a marriage license, that automatically the children that we had once we were married would automatically be the child of both of us. But that's not the case in Massachusetts. So even though culturally and familially we are the parents of our children, we are not legally the parents of our children unless we go through a time-consuming and costly process of adopting our own children. Massachusetts has the highest rate of assisted reproductive technology of any state in the nation, and yet our laws are behind every other state in New England. We're trying to change the law now with a piece of legislation called the Massachusetts Parentage Act. And the Parentage Act would update our laws so that LGBTQ couples would no longer have to adopt their own children, that gay men who want to go through surrogacy would have the laws correctly in place so that they could do that and be protected. And so we won huge numbers of rights when we won the right to marry, but we didn't win them all. And parentage is one of the big ones we didn't win.
Okay, so I want to go a little bit deeper into this question about what's next. I'm glad you brought up the parentage question, but it's not the only fight that continues in this state or in the country. So I'm curious if you could talk more, Arlene, about the efforts beyond gay marriage, the issues still at play here in Massachusetts.
Well, there's two answers to that. One is we've won the right to marry, but the Supreme Court undoing the Roe decision on abortion showed us that it may not be as over as we thought it was. Clarence Thomas indicated in his decision an interest in revisiting questions like marriage equality that was decided in the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's one huge issue, that a cloud that looms over us, if you will. Within the state level, what I said a moment ago about parentage and the Mass Parentage Act is absolutely a top priority legislation for our community because we need to protect our children. Just to add one more variable to that so that people understand it, without the protection of having adopted your child, or if this law doesn't change, you'd better not go on a family vacation to Disneyland in Florida, because if you get into a car accident, the non-biological parent could lose custody of the child if the bio parent doesn't make it through the car accident. That's how vulnerable our families are right now, especially if we go to a red state. So that's number one. But you're absolutely right, Simone. There are issues we have to work on for the trans community. One of the bills that the ACLU and GLAAD were working on last session was a SHIELD Act to protect those people who provide gender-affirming care to young people, like Boston Children's Hospital. We wanted to protect that so that states like Texas that prohibit gender-affirming care, we want their kids to be able to come to Massachusetts, if the parents choose that, to receive that kind of health care here and that kind of assistance here. We wanted to protect the providers of that service. And so we passed that just last session, but that's a battle that we're going to have to continue to work on. We're going to have to work on trans rights. We're going to have to work on AIDS and HIV issues. And we're going to have to work on the banning of books. One of the top priority issues that the ACLU is working on is preventing the banning of books around the state. And even though, again, people think it's a very progressive state, we have book ban problems all across the Commonwealth, and we're having to fight them town by town by town.
Okay, Arlene, I'm going to say it again. 20 years since gay marriage has been legal in Massachusetts. Why is it important to remember the history of this day?
I think it's very important to remember this day because it was not simply enormous for the state of Massachusetts, it was enormous for the country to finally see LGBTQ people getting married legally. We'd been getting married before, but it wasn't recognized under the law. And it totally changed the course of our nation's history. And it totally changed what other countries ended up doing. Because once Massachusetts had the right to marry for our people, then other states could do it as well. Once the United States could do it, then other countries could do it as well. It normalized it, and it showed to the world that which we had already been telling them, which is that we are just like everyone else. We are as boring as the rest of the world and as deserving of equality as everyone else, that we are a people who are good, decent, kind, hardworking, contributors to our culture and our economy, just like other people are. We are no different in that way. And so it's an enormously important day and an enormously important history. So I'm thrilled that you guys decided to cover it.
Well, that was Arlene Isaacson, co-chair of the Massachusetts GLBTQ Political Caucus. Arlene, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
And that's our show for today. Thanks so much for listening to The Common. It's Friday, so it's time to let you know that The Common is produced by Caitlin Harrop and Franny Monahan. It's mixed by Emily Jankowski, Matt Reed, and Paul Vikis. And it's edited by Samata Joshi and Ben Brock Johnson. Our theme music is Me by Hisu. And from the newsroom of WBUR, I'm Simone Rios, in for Daryl C. Murphy. Talk to you soon.